Well, welcome everybody. It's good to see you all. Um, this is another conversation on the future of work. And before we get started, I'd like to quickly say thank you to the National Science Foundation as they're partially funding this effort. And of course, the organizers, Linda Boyle, John Lee, Raffaella Sadun, Manfred Tscheligi, and then Orit, Shaer, and myself who are here today. And this is a recorded conversation. Please put your questions in the chat, and Orit will be moderating questions today. So we're thrilled to have our friend Duncan Brumby with us. Duncan is a professor of human-computer interaction at University College London, where he directs the HCI Master of Science program and also leads a research group that focuses on investigating how people manage digital distractions. He's also the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Human-Computer Studies, and he's held positions previously at Georgia Tech, Drexel, Microsoft Research, and Park. And so, Duncan, I just wanted to jump right in and talk about emails. So you recently ran an experiment in which you sent people 120 emails per week for 3 weeks. And I was wondering why? Why did you send them so many emails? And so what are those questions that really drove this experiment?
Great. So before I get started, I just want to say it's great to see as well two co-authors of the paper on the call as well, Anna Cox and Sandy Gould. So they're also here as well, which is really great. So we had an interest in studying email. And what you see in the literature is a bunch of people, how do people look at email? So you get things like interview studies or diary studies, where you go talk to people and say, hey, how do you manage your email? And you learn different strategies that people use, and it's very kind of reflective in that way. And that's nice, you learn some things. But what really inspired this work was there was a Kai paper back in 2011, and it was an experiment where this was done at the CMU, and they got their undergraduate participants to come in and basically play an administrator for an hour. So they gave them the Enron email database and started throwing them loads of emails for an hour, and they had to process them. And we thought this was really neat. And so we decided we wanted to kind of take this out and put it into the world. So kind of to do a mixture of these two methods of both experiment, but also kind of out there in the world where we're really sending people real emails. So this is why we sent people lots of emails. So it allows you to conduct an experiment, manipulate features of the email, but sending it to their real email account. So not fully lab. So you kind of have this this field experiment set up. And so, I think what you're saying there is what's the research question? And it's how do people manage this, right? So that's really the thing we want to learn, is that we know people receive a lot of email. We know they find it difficult to process it. We know people reflect on and say things like, oh, I respond to my friends first, or I respond to my close colleagues first, but when I get a lot, things get more challenging. These are all kind of anecdotal. So by going to this field experiment approach, we're able to take control and manipulate the emails that we're sending people, and then look to see what they do with them in the context of this game we set up, the gamified situation, essentially.
So how did those features affect what people did with emails? What did you find?
Yeah, so that was in the abstract I sent round. So there were three things we looked at. One was the urgency of the message. So the way this worked is that when we sent you an email, you got points for responding to it. And we manipulated three things. The first one was how quickly you had to respond in order to get those points. So 20 minutes, 3 hours, 24 hours. So this kind of urgency of response. The next one was how effortful the response was to make. So is it a simple like copy and paste, simple yes, no response, or is it more you had to do stuff, like go do an activity to then make the response? And then the other one was importance, how many points were on offer. So some of these things are kind of like you might expect. So you might figure that importance should really drive that. If I that email from the more senior person, or that email from the important colleague, or the big grant announcement, or the big paper, you'll go, like, I'm going to respond to that first if it needs a response. And that did happen, but it was moderated by this urgency manipulation. So when you gave people longer to respond, these other factors started really moderating behavior like you'd expect. So when you give people 24 hours to respond, yeah, they respond to the important stuff first, the stuff that's worth more. And they respond to the stuff that's easier to respond to first. But the moment you start making it that you want a response within this 20-minute window, this 20-minute window or nothing at all, that's how the point's working, then all of those other cues go out the window. People are like blindsided by the urgency that they kind of just go in there and they just feel the need to respond immediately. So that was the main, I think the surprising finding, and the main finding for us was that this idea that there's all these kind of intuitive cues that you assume people should be sensitive to, and they are sensitive to them, but this urgency is trumping, urgency overrides everything else. So when you make something really, an urgent response is needed, like within the next few minutes of seeing this, then suddenly you're not really rationally processing and making sensible decisions about how to triage in terms of importance and value and effort involved.
Huh, that's really interesting. So as an aside, that sort of reminds me of that Seven Habits of Highly Successful People? What's that famous book? But I think one of the issues that was discussed is sort of this urgency versus importance. So it's kind of a very interesting.
Yeah, we talk about that kind of like the Eisenhower quadrants situation. We talk about that in the introduction to the paper.
Nice.
For sure. And yeah, the dangerous stuff is the urgent trivia. So the stuff that's really not important, but it needs a response right now, and people are shouting from the rooftops for it. Of course, that never happens. We all have a very respectful experiences over email, I'm sure.
So I wanted to change slightly to planning, and you co-authored a recent CCW paper with Joanna and Anna, and I think maybe both of them are here today. And I wanted to congratulate all of you because this was an honorable mention paper, but it's about planning and the mistakes that we make when we plan our tasks. And I was wondering how email plays into this, and if you can maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, this is Joanna Amaguli's PhD work, and she's a PhD student working with Anna Cox and me at UCL. And what Joanna's really interested in is this how people go out planning their workday and focusing on people like us, academics and the like. And we're an interesting group. We are an interesting group because we have a lot of there are some things which are fixed, but there's other things we have quite a lot of discretion over how they're done. And what Joanna did was to pick up this research method that had been used by William Newman in a paper from a whole bunch of years ago, where it was a very simple idea that you get people to write down what they want to do at the beginning of the day, and then you get them to see what they actually did at the end of the day, and you look at the difference. And so what Joanna did there was to pick up and categorize different tasks to see where planning was right and where it was wrong and where it was not working. And I don't know if this will surprise you or not, but email is one of these things that we just get spectacularly wrong in terms of, I'm going to go through my inbox. You know, I've got 100 unread messages. I'm going to give it an hour. I'm going to succeed at that. Good luck. You know, you may think it's going to take you an hour. We found people spent 33% more time on email than they expected or planned to. So email is one of these tasks where you may set up a plan to deal with it in a certain amount of time, but it eats more, it demands more. And some of that is because, as we know, email is difficult to plan for because you don't, sometimes knowing what's, once you dig into a message, those responses aren't always straightforward. So it becomes very uncertain. Whereas other tasks, it's the other way around. You know, you plan for a certain amount of time and you find that you can actually get it done. The fear of doing it is greater, but when you sit down to do it, like writing tasks, this was primarily, you actually spend a lot less time than you planned.
And then I wanted to ask you one more question before we move on to audience questions. And this is about another paper. It's a Tokai paper with Judith and Anna. And this is about distractions at work and how we deal with them. And again, let me go back to, you know, how do email messages distract us and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, this is Judith Bauhutz's PhD work, and Judith is now working on a postdoc position with Gloria Mark at UC Irvine, which is really nice, continuing this line of work. And yeah, so Judith's, what Judith was interested in was those interruptions where you're doing a task and you need to go find some information to advance that task. So, you know, the classic example is going to go find your wallet so you can pay for something while shopping on the internet or something like that. So you have to go stand up and go find something in the world and come back. And Judith's idea was that these little intrusions to go find something take way longer than you would think. You think it's going to be 30 seconds, but actually you're gone for like 10 minutes. So we're thinking, how can we get at this? How can we design a study where we can kind of build in these self-interruptions in a natural way? So we can get an online experiment being run, but then we want people to go off and become distracted to go find something else. And for us, you know, the research methodology contribution here was to think of email as a natural, ecologically motivated form of self-distraction. So we got our participants signed up to this study, they did the task, and then we basically told them, go find that thing we sent you in your inbox to go get some information. And sure enough, the moment our participants switched into their inbox, they were gone. So there's always those unexpected distractions when you go look at your inbox and just glance at it. Even though you went there for a purpose, you're almost certainly going to find something else that's come in that will kind of send you down the rabbit hole. And so this was, I guess, more of a methodological contribution. There was a nice contribution there in Judith's work around how to design for this, but I think the methodology was really neat there, because we'd been thinking, this is work we'd also been doing with Sandy Gould for a number of years, about thinking about how to design in these natural interruptions. Because in interruptions research, it's very hard to do that, to give people, to get them naturally distracted when you're giving them a task to do. But email was something that we find people are quite easily distracted by. So there's always going to be something there.
So this is great. I think that we have some questions from the audience, if that's a good time, Andrew.
Sure.
Okay, great. So first I have a question, but I see some opportunities here for, instead of thinking how to help users of emails, to think about how to help designers and businesses through dark patterns, right? So what I'm hearing is that if I'm writing urgent on the emails that I'm sending, and if I'm providing a lot of distractions, I get some power and impact over users. So what are your thoughts about design patterns for emails that could have negative effects? And we see that with, you know, election emails, we see that with marketing emails.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the case for marketing emails. You know, the flash sale is a thing, right? You know, click this link now because it's going to be gone within 24 hours. I think the source, people, I mean, we're in that email work, we're interested in inbox level queues. So what we do know, of course, is that sender does matter, right, as well. So I think there's been some nice work at Kai looking at how people set up different accounts. You know, some people set up whole separate Gmail accounts just to receive all their marketing stuff and try to keep their actual people communications to another place. So that's the kind of commercial side. Of course, it becomes more difficult when people start filtering all this stuff into one inbox and they have to work harder to separate these two things out. But yeah, you said, I mean, that was the kind of take home from this. If you want a response from your colleague, put the word urgent there. Don't put important, put urgent. That's more likely to elicit a response. So that's, I suppose, the most practical tip from this research is if you want your colleagues to respond to you, write urgent, not important.
Okay, wait for my next email.
It's always to the perspective of who important to whom, whereas urgency is more of a, you know, there is a deadline to it.
Okay, so that's good to know. I'll kind of try to use it on all of you. But we have some questions with some kind of asking for more details. So maybe we'll start with Liz. Liz, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, thank you so much for being here today. I just had like two questions, one of them about the experiment itself. I believe you mentioned that the number of weeks you sent, number of emails you sent per week was 120. And I was wondering where you came up with that number, and then also if the reply that you received from an email you sent, if that was rated in any way.
Okay, sure. So these are great questions. So the study ran for 3 weeks, and it was 120 emails were sent to each participant per week. How do we get to that number? The short answer is we ran this over a couple of pilot studies. So we had various student projects that were done around this time frame. And I think what the final one that we published was based upon the 3rd iteration of that. So I think some of that came out just through natural piloting and, craft skill there in terms of what was working. Because I think we wanted to strike that balance with our participants where we wanted to send them enough emails that they weren't going to be able to get on top of everything, but we didn't want to completely swamp them so that they then it became like spam and they just kind of withdrew from the experiment completely, which, actually did happen to some extent. So we did lose some of our participants in the final study. They just kind of dropped out because they were receiving too many emails, presumably, and they didn't want to take part anymore. So some of that is just simply we tried to find a balancing act between too few, too many. And also some of it was just driven by practical considerations because we had an experimental design here and you wanted to fill out that experimental design, and it was repeated measures with a number of conditions. And so you have to have a number of cells in that design, and then you want to send a number of emails that fit within that. So that also provides the kind of lower limit. We couldn't send just a couple emails because we wouldn't have been able to run the experiment that way. So a lot of that, it was born out of practical considerations. In terms of how the emails themselves were then picked up, there were these 2 conditions, the easy response and the hard response. And in the easy response, what you saw here is the email came in from the research address, and you got some cues in the header that told you what the email was worth and how quickly you had to respond. And then when you went to the body, it had a string in there of basically, think of a long password, and they had to copy and paste that, put it in the subject line, and then send it back. That was the easy response. The hard response was there was a link, you click the link, and it took you off to like an Amazon Mechanical Turk-like task, where you had to do some classifications, click some buttons. These tasks took a couple of minutes to complete. Think of the captures, this type of stuff that you experience. And when you'd completed this, then you got that string, the passcode, which you could then copy in and send back. So that's how these responses. So the responses were not, your question there was around grading the responses, and that we designed it in such a way that it could run at scale as an experiment. So we weren't actually getting people to write meaningful responses in that sense. Action was required for them in order to get the points. But this is what I'm saying. It's a field experiment. It's kind of a quasi, it's not full lab, but it's also not full field. So it's this kind of mixing of methods.
Thank you for clarifying that. So Abigail and Linda have related questions. So maybe Abigail can ask and Linda can ask, and then you can address both of them together. Abigail, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure. Yeah, I was wondering if whether in the study or in research before you started fieldwork, if you looked into other forms of communication, whether it was, Slack or GChat or texting or whatnot, and anything that you found about if those forms are more helpful or if there's sort of similar problems regardless.
And Linda, do you want to add to that before Duncan is?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to say that, when I communicate with like some of my students these days, email is actually not the best form of communication to reach out to them. So I wonder, I'm just curious how your work, just looking at your paper may actually transcend to the way other means of communications with people. And are there certain types of messages that are only best sent via email?
So yeah, I think across these, thanks, these are great questions. I think across both these questions, it's kind of predicting the death of, when will email finally die and be replaced by something better? And I think, in short, I mean, what we've seen, I think, this is a very optimistic view. I think you're right, that some people have transitioned away from email and use, whether that be Slack or Teams or WhatsApp. Any others are out there? WeChat, what else? What else can we use? And then we get into the kind of more straight, you know, the social media stuff like Twitter, which is more for broadcasting, presumably. Yeah, there are definitely more mechanisms out there for communication. More communication tools are out there. But email's a dinosaur. It's going to keep on. Well, that's a terrible analogy, of course, because dinosaurs are extinct. Let me wind that back a little bit. Email keeps on, right? So certainly we've seen over the last 6 months, various things like Teams in particular has really been advocated within the faculty to kind of do a lot of the institutional communication. But it all still goes over email. So now what you end up having is it just coming out across 2 different sources. Then you get the situation where you're like, which source am I paying attention to here? I know some colleagues out there, not naming any names, of course, but you know, that can be overwhelming, right? You know, which one to give you. Sometimes it's easier just to focus on one channel instead of having these kind of like 5 different channels. And it's like, which one is it on again? We only looked at email here. So, you know, I think whether or not these results would replicate to these other communication channels, that would be a good question for future research. So I hope, you know, this paper we're talking about before this meeting got started, the paper's in the production pipeline at Human Computer Interaction Journal. So what would be really nice is if we're able to take this forward in the future and replicate this with different forms of communication like these other channels. I think there was some nice work looking, if you think just about something like WhatsApp, when that got started, there was a nice paper from Kenton O'Hara at Mobile HCI many years ago now, basically showing that it had a privileged place at that point because it was quite a narrow focus of, you know, it had low bandwidth in the sense that not many people were hitting people up on messages that way. But I think now it's all about how many messages you receive on each communication channel. In terms of what works well for each channel, that would be interesting for future research, Linda, I think. So what type of communication, what type of content, and there are interesting and important subtle differences between some of these tools, like whether or not, for instance, a message can be deleted. So this is something we've been looking at in recent work is on some of these channels, you can, of course, redact your message and it's gone from the stream. In other ones, it's there forever. And obviously, as we know with email, the worst thing about email is if you hit send, there's no way of easily pulling it back. You always get those people that, well, those occasional emails that come around the office that say, please ignore the thing I just sent out. So there are certain qualities to the medium of communication here that are interesting, I think, to pick up on. But yeah, some of it's an empirical question, though, about whether these particular findings that we found actually generalize to these other settings. I would assume that they would. I think urgency would trump out. And I think my gut feeling is that some of these channels we do respond to quite quickly. And maybe some of that's going to be individual preferences, whether we're choosing to monitor our WhatsApp or our Teams or whichever one is important to us personally.
You know, that's interesting because what we consider is important. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kind of jump in. But what some of us feel like one medium is important, another person may feel another one is. So I'll give you an example. Sometimes I'll just log into WhatsApp after like several months, and there's a series of messages that they're like over or right now a month old, and just trying to figure out how to, get back into the conversation, for example.
Yeah, sometimes for sure. So there's definitely some kind of like, alignment an alignment process has to happen. And you see this happening with communities. I mean, in our different roles, right? Many of us have volunteer roles in the community. And you can see this happening with every one of those volunteer roles where there's some degree of discussion about what is the particular channel that's going to be used for that role. So, the CHI organization will do one thing, our journals might do another thing. And, is it going to be Slack? Is it going to, and what's going to be, and there needs to be some kind of, we need to go through this process now almost of having agreement and alignment. It's one thing for employers to expect us to use a certain channel, but it's another thing for many of these kind of volunteer roles. And then you move into the social roles, of course, and then it becomes different expectations yet again, right? Whether or not your friends are choosing to, and how they're using these different tools. But yeah, I think what we do know is, I mean, Linda, you said there about information going stale. I mean, that's what we know about from the nice work that Gloria Mark did a whole bunch of years ago, where they got people to live without email. And it very quickly becomes irrelevant. you know, if you go away for 2 weeks, that policy where you just delete your email is probably pretty sensible, because the vast majority of it is basically gone off. It's got a best before date.
Thank you. And I think that's related to kind of Albert's questions and comments. Albert, do you want to kind of unmute?
So I'm sort of my experience with basically each new communication tool that comes into the lab really works very well till everybody uses it. So we had this with Slack, we had it with WhatsApp. So basically and I think that one of the basic questions for me is, I think it is not the tool we are using. We are running up against the fundamental problem. So basically I have, let's say I work 8 hours, responding to a message takes between 1 and 5 minutes, depending on, or even one, and we did sort of at some Dachstuhl seminar some time back, we figured that by 2025, the only thing we can do in an 8-hour workday is responding to messages. And I think we are still on track for the curve. So and I think one of the things I see, and that would be interesting to see what your experience is. So one of the things I see is and that's troubling me, is basically we try to send to groups, which basically increases the cost. So I think the thing with having CC in messages, which is not costly, having Slack, where basically I'm in a meeting with 10 people, and basically it's from a sender, it makes it cheaper and cheaper for the sender to cover the bases. So basically if I put the whole team CC, nobody can say they haven't seen. But obviously and we did also, it was a student project some time back where we did just a concept for billing email time to the sender within a company. It was not with the outside, just within a company. So basically looking how much an email is. At that time, it was not feasible to do this calculation. So basically you guess how much an email would cost to answer, and you just bill it to your project. So basically if you don't put anybody CC, the email is probably sort of €1. But if you put the whole team CC, it becomes a few €100 at no time. So I think my two questions are, is this sort of the wrong research you're doing? So just a bit of a challenge. So is this sort of, should we not rather figure out that we communicate less? And the other one is sort of the whole model of having no cost associated to the sender, but only to the receiver. That what we should address in future designs.
Yes. So yeah, this is the trouble with all these communications. There's zero cost on the sender to put it out there, and the cost is always borne by the receiver's attention, right? To process it, to make a response, and you know, the most extreme situation you get spam, right? But I think we do learn about this through research. So I think people are. One of the claims in our paper here is that people are adaptive in their communication, that they do adjust their thresholds, and that they are sensitive to these cues of like importance, apart from when this urgency comes in. And I guess that's, if I wind back a little bit, urgency breaks stuff. But if you don't put people under this pressure of respond now, so turn those notifications off and allow a slower response cycle, what happens there is that people are quite sensible in terms of their order of triaging. So when they hit their inbox, they go through it more or less in priority orders. That's what the evidence we found. And that also does reflect, you know, going back to this issue about how much email people receive, going back to this original Kai 2011 paper from Weiner and colleagues at CNU, they varied the volume of email that these participants were receiving in that situation. And what you found is that when you start basically turning the taps on high pressure, people just kind of start skimming more and more. And I think you see people doing this quite naturally in organizations. As they get higher and higher up, the volume of email increases. And you know, you can certainly either reflect on your own experience of how that's changed over the years for you personally, or talk to colleagues about their experiences over the years. But this is one of the things that we do find fairly consistently is when you talk to people about their experiences of things like emails, that the volume changes over time and depending on your position in a hierarchy. And what happens there is you have to recalibrate and readjust your strategy. So going back to I was talking about Joanna's work, and one of the things that was driving this work around planning was looking in at these moments of where people take a strategy that's working for them at their particular moment or their previous point in their career. Basically, a strategy that was working for the last year, and then thinking about how it needs to be reconfigured. I'm sure many of us have been doing this over the last 6 to 9 months. We had a way of working, and we've had to radically rethink that as we've all changed the way that we've worked. And whether that be around our planning, but you see this like a local level, which we've all kind of experienced to some extent over the last 6 months. But as people progress up and they receive more and more volume of emails, that you get this kind of different ways of handling it. I think the tech industry, though, is a little bit guilty, though, because what it has done is that previously, of course, communications like this in organizations, it wasn't the sole responsibility of the person to handle it. There was more support. And one of the problems about personal computers is that they are personal. And we've talked about this, actually, I recall at a Daxtel seminar last time we were there in person. But it's basically put all the responsibility back onto the individual. So it's my email account that I receive. And of course, sometimes people do have people that handle their emails for them and help them with them. But I'd say that is quite a rare thing. I mean, can't wait for it to happen for myself personally speaking. But, you know, it is this sense of it's a personal thing. And I think that's one of the challenges in organizations is kind of how to separate that out and not put too much responsibility on the individual. The individual will be able to cope to a degree, but the way that they cope, of course, is to become very selective. And so a lot of stuff gets missed.
Can I just have one more point, which I think you haven't really picked up on? I think this cost distribution between sender and receiver, a lot of the things also sending, for example, with WhatsApp, making it really easy to send sort of text messages, but spoken, like sort of a spoken text, or sending videos. Again, sort of a lot of the research goes into making it easy to send messages, because there's obviously sort of from the company's perspective, there is a good business model to keep people talking, but the cost on the receiver side is not. And I think I use the analogy of the real world. So basically, if I'm in the office, sometimes people are queuing up outside my office. And if there are too many people, they will just walk away because they figure out it takes too long till I get in there. And so basically the communication, how busy I am to the others, I think, again, we haven't seen much of this. So basically people don't see how busy I am. And I think this is sort of ignoring the receiver side in the designs is, in my view, really sort of a tricky part.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, so this is something we've talked about lots, but bringing it to action, I think, is. But my bet would be that many of us, particularly for close colleagues, we have a relatively good mental model for, and I'd say it's probably quite accurate, would be my guess, about how likely am I to get a response from somebody within a set time frame. And just looking at some of the, you know, got close collaborators and on this call, and I know that you know, you have an idea about who's going to be very responsive, and I'll put myself into that category of not being terribly responsive. So it varies, I think, and I think we do keep track of that. So I'm trying to think. We have looked at this around, this is like student projects, and getting at it is very difficult, but I think it is something that's kind of interesting to look at. And then the question becomes, of course, if people do have accurate models, well, the first question is, do they have accurate models? And then if they're not accurate, in which ways are they inaccurate? Assuming that they are accurate to a degree, maybe they're biased in certain directions, how do they then use that? I think these systems are two-way streets in a way. Communication works in both ways. I don't think, you know, once people get an idea, they're not going to get response back very quickly from somebody, then they adjust their behavior. So I take your point, Albert, that there is the cost of sending an email is free, but I think there is a great deal of moderation that takes place when we think about the various different people that we email and how quickly and what type of response we might expect. And I think there is some people, there is carelessness, obviously, where people just kind of send stuff out blanketly, you know. We all have those types of emails where people have clearly hit the entire department asking if they can join as a PhD student, for instance, and they tend to get disregarded. And it's amazing that that feedback signal isn't there, it's not working. But that's the thing with spam, is that you don't need, if you hit enough people and you only just want one person to catch, that's, I suppose it's still working for them. But in more, you know, network communities, I think there are these kind of interdependencies, and people do learn. And there have been attempts to get at this through like prisoner dilemma-like games where you get people to play. But again, taking that forward in an actionable way for research and then taking it through to implications is a challenge, I think, for future work in this area.
So talking about challenging for future work, I want to conclude kind of the formal part of our conversation with a question from Susanna. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Oh, great.
Thank you. I think that was also extremely very interesting. A lot of topics were also mentioned. My one or two questions are, now that you have shown us what is the problem so well, the question is, you know, how can you help us? You know, so I was sort of tuning in today with a big hope saying, okay, my emails problem going to be solved by Duncan. So one of the, you know, being higher up now, sort of in the sense of email load, I was wondering if AI could not do a big amount of work in sort of collecting and clustering and maybe even feeding the important message into other tools. Maybe I attend better.
Yeah, there have been, I mean, this is outside of certainly my area, but yeah, this is where people have tried to do automatic responses or automatic forwarding, especially if it's this is where you kind of need that kind of taxonomy to categorizing the different types of emails that exist, right? The kind of those that are kind of like Albert was talking about the kind of sharing, team sharing stuff, where it becomes more of a kind of document repository type thing. Then you get the ones where it's like somebody needs to connect somebody else, which is a straightforward forwarding thing, and that could almost be automated, you can imagine. But hey, as we know from other work we've been doing, that there's problems around automation, right? So suddenly it goes off and a robot takes care of it, but then, you know, understanding what's going on under the hood. I mean, we trust this to a degree. It's why we all rely on spam filters operating. Of course, bringing that up to when you get kind of priority inboxes and stuff like that, which Google tried a few years ago, that becomes a bit more of a tricky thing when it starts doing stuff on your behalf and writing things on your behalf.
Yeah, but it doesn't necessarily have to be writing, but it would be very happy if it were, like, I have a personal assistant who is really doing a good job in finding some emails saying, look, you haven't responded to them and it seems to be you should, and so on, and there was a deadline and you might have overlooked and so on. So she is very capable of doing that, and I'm sure other of you maybe have some kind of support, and I think that mapping some of this into my email box would be really a pleasure. So I think, what are the HCI tools and what are the data science tools? And with the HCI tools and everything on the interface, it's even more tedious to sort or more tedious to tag. So actually I have given up on all of these things very quickly again, because it's not solving I have like a 30,000-40,000 inbox, and I'm even trying to once in a while really delete a lot of them. So it's really an unsolvable problem for me.
Well, exactly, and that's the trouble, is that these things just become eventually unusable, right? But arguably, you know, even though a whole bunch of stuff is falling to the wayside, your job is still moving forward, right? So maybe people find other ways of reaching you, whether it be through scheduled meetings or reaching out to other people within the group to get a response and take things forward. So it is essentially a communication tool, but one that, yeah, does suffer this load problem. And yeah, regrettably, we don't have the great answer to solve the problem. We wanted to first understand. That was our, you know, we're coming from the perspective of understanding what people are doing and trying to shed some light on what to sharpen up those intuitions about what we think people might be doing to actually demonstrate that empirically. But yeah, hopefully those empirical insights can then be taken forward in the next round of research and actually taken and actioned to make better tools and systems.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Duncan. This was really fun. Thanks for spending time with us, and thanks for sharing your insights, and thank you for the questions. So I'd like to wrap up this formal part by reminding everybody that next week Birsan Delmez will join us, and Birsan is here with us today as well. Hi, Birsan. And she'll talk about some future ideas about cars, so smarter cars and safer ? So hopefully safer driving. So looking forward to that conversation.